Hi everyone, today we're going to go over assessments for ELLs. First off, let's go through our objectives. So you're going to understand formal, informal, and alternative methods of assessment and evaluation that serves both language acquisition and content mastery needs of ELLs. You also should be able to differentiate norm and criterion reference tests. You should also be able to talk about the different types of reliability that exist, as well as validity and how they're important to test design and assessment. We're going to be discussing the problematic factors of test design and assessment for ELLs. Also you're going to be discussing what may be problematic about accommodation for ELLs. Okay, so to begin with, I'd like you to think about if you yourself have ever observed harmful effects that high-stakes testing has friends or anybody you've seen sort of go through high-stakes testing in the K through 12 period. And then think about how that may be for ELLs, right? And then we're going to consider today how these harmful effects could be minimalized. Okay, so let's talk about some serious truths. Last time that we discussed the laws, we ended up by talking about in CLB. And if you remember, it involved a large emphasis on assessment. So today we're going to continue sort of thinking about the ramifications of assessment and consider how this focus on assessment has really influenced the educational system, and especially for ELLs. Okay, so ELLs are probably the most tested students in our educational system. In addition to taking the same federal state tests that all students have to take, ELLs take language proficiency tests every year as well. ELLs also participate in district level and school level tests, and they take classroom-based tests developed by classroom teachers. So actually, there's one case where in a Texas school district, between March and the end of the school year, 5th grade bilingual students were required to take 9 different state and district tests. Okay, so it's obviously sort of exaggerated in a way. So it's important that educators need to be aware of the heavy testing burden placed on ELL students and the impact that these test results can have on students and teachers' lives. Test results are often used to determine whether students are placed in or exited from the special programs, if they're allowed to pass to the next grade level, if they required summer school attendance, or if they're even awarded a diploma at all. So test scores are often used to judge the adequacy of skills of teachers as well, and to determine, for example, which teachers would receive monetary rewards, which teachers should be obtaining additional training, and also sometimes which teachers should be finding another job. So it's really important, some of these serious truths to keep in mind about tests. And we think about the power of tests. Here is a couple things to keep in mind to really understand that sort of the dynamic at play when students take these tests. Okay, so we know that tests are administered by powerful institutions. The people who take it have little power, and the institution sort of has this idea, or is using this idea, this non-negotiable idea of knowledge and what they're going to count knowledge as. And usually they have non-negotiable control over that knowledge. The tests use the language of science, right? Academic language. And so statistical, objective, empirical. Okay, so tests use the language of science, which is statistical, objective, empirical, and it's academic language, so it's a particular dialect. Sentence structures, terminology, vocabulary usage is different than the way that people would speak informally or normally, sort of outside of the classroom. And so having access to that dialect, using that register when you're at school, grants authority status and power, right? So those people who have mastered that register are going to have a leg up on the others. It also is a test that uses the language of numbers, right? So objectivity, scientism, rationality. It's a written form of communication, which means that the written exam is a one-way test of communication, right? There's no way that students who are taking the test can be more subjective in their answers. And so there's not really a consideration of the test taker's views or interpretations of what they mean. It's usually graded as incorrect or correct based on the way that the institution in power is negotiating that knowledge. It relies on documentation. So once those tests have been taken, they are coded into scores, right? And it becomes an object. The test score, test taker is really removed from that score. And it also is used to represent groups, right? So even there, test takers become one of many, in a sense, as they are grouped. And then, as I sort of talked about before, the tests use objective formats. So true, false, multiple choice. There's usually one correct answer, one truth, one interpretation. Okay, let's talk about some factors affecting performance. So the performance gap between ELL and non-ELL students can be explained by the following. Parents' education level, poverty, for example, the socioeconomic status of the student, challenge of second language acquisition, right? Remember that it's all about exposure, opportunity, and input, right? How much experience they had with the language, and students have different experiences or opportunities for language learning. Gender is found to affect performance, affect the gap between ELL and non-ELL students. Inequitable schooling conditions, right? Sometimes the fault lies with the school. The school doesn't have enough resources. Ethnicity is shown to mark a difference because, as we've talked about before, school is targeted or represents the culture of middle-class white students. Okay, so everyone else is at a disadvantage because that's the culture that the school represents, the classroom. Okay, the cultural experiences is something that comes in between ELL and non-ELL students and their performance. And as I had talked about briefly before with academic language, the dialect as well, right? So those students who own academic language, the registers of maybe science, math, social studies, those students are going to perform higher, and it's shown to be a performance gap between ELL and non-ELL students. However, I want to also point out that there are certain linguistic and cultural biases in assessment that impact the judgment, the way that the school, administrators, teachers judge ELL students. So, for example, Hispanic students are the largest group of ELLs and also found to be the least likely to be reclassified out of the ESOL program. So 57% of Hispanics versus 77% of Asians versus 68% of Caucasians were found to exit ESOL. So you can see here that Asian and Caucasian students are reclassified in half the time needed for Hispanic students, even though Hispanic students, ELL students, make up the majority in that group, in that ELL group. Okay, so there are certain linguistic and cultural biases in assessment that do harm ELL students. So now we're going to get into some of the basics before we continue on with some of the sort of problematic aspects of assessment for ELLs. Okay, it's important that you understand the different concepts of assessment. So the first question that we're going to target is, what are the differences between testing, assessment, and evaluation? Okay, so let's start with test, right? Testing refers to the administration of tests, right? So a test is a single instrument designed to systematically measure a sample of a student's ability at one particular time. A test, you can think about it as like a photographic snapshot, right? A snapshot can be misleading because it doesn't show what took place before or after it's taken, or even, for example, the context in which it was taken. But also, a single test does not provide any information about what a student could do before or after taking the test. And a test, one single test, cannot possibly show everything that the student is capable of doing, right, and all of their knowledge. So remember that that test is telling you at that specific moment, in the way that the test is designed, what the student can do, right? So we should be careful as teachers to treat tests as just a sample of a student's knowledge and ability. For example, in math, a sample of problems can be tested, and from that sample, we can attempt to make some inference about the test taker's math ability in general, right? Again, but you see how much inferencing is going on. So you're using one test, which probably focuses on one aspect of math, and you're using that and inferencing on the student's math ability in general, right? So we have to take a lot of care in making inferences. Okay, that is different to assessment, right? So assessment is much broader than testing. And you can define this as the systematic, iterative process of planning, collecting, analyzing, reporting, and using student data from a variety of sources over time. Okay? So, for example, assessment involves planning what, how, and when to assess, and you would pay attention to, for example, the different purposes, including the different stakeholders such as students, parents, teachers, also the administrators, either local or statewide. You would also focus on collecting the appropriate data from the variety of sources, right, so that you are getting a good range in terms of what the student can do. And that could include, for example, informal observations in class to more formal scoring of students' performances on specific tasks. That analyzing the student data, you would be looking for strengths to build on from the student, identifying areas of need where you could incorporate more instruction or assistance, reporting student strengths and needs in ways that are beneficial for the students, the teachers, and the school, and then using the student performance to identify what students must learn in order to progress to the next level. So, as you can see, assessment, even though that word is sort of thrown around here and there, assessment is very particular in terms of what it means, right? And it is systematic, it is continuous, and that's what iterative means, of that cycle of planning, collecting, analyzing, reporting, and using it to inform your instruction. Okay, and then we get to evaluation, right? And evaluation is different to assessment in that it refers to using that evidence that you gather through assessment to make a judgment about the effectiveness of the student's learning. Okay, so for example, final grades are one example of a student evaluation. Teachers can use assessment data to evaluate the effectiveness of their teaching as well, and then they can sort of make adjustments accordingly. Assessment data is also used by educational leaders, for example, administrators, to evaluate programs and determine whether what needs to change in the program, whether the program is meeting the needs of the children. Remember when we talked about the Castaneda and Pickard law, and we had the Castaneda, the 3 levels of sort of evaluation come out. Those were put into place to make sure that the programs that were serving ELLs were effective, and that provided sort of a basis for evaluation, right? Again, that evaluation is using that assessment data, making judgments from it. Okay, so let's talk about the difference between summative and formative assessments, okay? So a summative assessment provides a summary of what a student knows and can do. Summative assessments typically are given at the end of a unit or perhaps at the end of a school year. And so you can also, if we use our morphology, you can also tell summative, right? One of the root word to summative, which is a complex word made up of more than one morpheme, is sum. And we know that sum is the whole, right? It's the total after adding everything up. And so summative is always going to be an assessment of complete knowledge, right? For example, an end of course comprehensive final exam, because that's a sum of what the student has learned throughout the year. Okay? And hopefully that'll help you distinguish summative from formative. So instead, a formative assessment provides information to a teacher about how a student is doing and what modifications may be needed in instruction at that particular time. So think of formative assessments as helping inform teachers what to do next instructionally. Okay? So for example, it could be an in-class activity. Obviously, that in-class activity is going to tell the teacher, has the student learned the objective for today, right? Or how is the student doing with this particular concept? Also, a teacher observing a small group work. That tells the teacher, how is the student doing at this point, okay? So again, it may be a formal assessment. Formative assessment could be more formal or more informal, like the observation of the group. And obviously, effective teachers are going to use both of these types of assessments to help inform their knowledge of what the student can do and what they should be doing next instructionally. Okay, so now we're going to go over activity 1. And you can find this activity in the Blackboard where you're watching this video. So for each of the following descriptions, I'd like you to indicate which type of assessment is represented. Formative or summative. What you can do right now is pause the video. You can go find the activity sheet and fill this in. You can write just an F or an S depending on whether you believe 1 through 6 is formative or summative. Okay. So you can pause the video right now, and once you're done, you can replay it, and I will go over the answers for you. Okay, so an achievement test is used to certify student mastery. This would be summative because the key word here is mastery, right? Mastery. So it's being used to figure out what does the student know up until now, right? Summative. Students are given a 10-item test to determine learning progress. That's formative, right? Because here we have the keyword learning progress. So it's a formative assessment because it's informing the teacher whereabout the student is at this point. Number 3, a teacher observes the process used as a student solves arithmetic problems. Okay, formative, again, because it's all about the process being used and that particular moment. Number 4, algebra students take an arithmetic test on the first day of class. Formative. Now, some of you may have said summative because you're thinking that the teacher wants to know what the students have learned the last year. But think about it. This is just an arithmetic test. It's not going to show everything that the students have learned the last year. And the purpose of that test is to inform the teacher where the student is around about this moment. Okay? Number 5, course grades are assigned. Summative, right? Course grades, we know that that represents everything that the student has learned in that year. So it's summative. Number 6, an assessment is given at the beginning of a new unit. Okay? Formative. Again, sort of similar to number 4, where the teacher is trying to gauge what the students know before they get into the unit.